Welcome to our webinar today titled Making and Keeping Customer Promises. Avoid 3 mistakes that can kill customer loyalty and your business. Thank you for joining us. I'm Laura Beth Ezel from Supply Chain Dive Studio ID team. In this webinar, we've gathered several experts to discuss how retailers can over-deliver on their brand promises despite today's fulfillment resources challenges. Before we begin, here are some tips to help you optimize your webinar experience. At the bottom of your screen, you'll find multiple application widgets. Each of these is resizable and movable, so feel free to adjust them in whatever way is most convenient or comfortable for you. The slides will advance automatically throughout the presentation. To enlarge the slides, click the Enlarge Slides button in the top right corner of your presentation window. Now, if you need any technical assistance, please click the Help widget in the bottom left corner of your screen at any time during the webinar. Now, we encourage you to submit questions at any time during the presentation using the Q&A widget. Please know we do capture all questions, and we want to make sure you receive an answer. After the presentation is completed today, you'll also receive a link that gives you on-demand access to the webinar so you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues. Well, with that covered, I'm going to hand things off to Terry O'Hanlon, Chief Marketing Officer at Gray Orange, to get us started. Terry?
Thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to Making and Keeping Customer Promises, avoiding 3 mistakes that can kill customer loyalty and your business. Every day, millions of consumers are placing orders online, a practice that we all saw get taken to new heights by the pandemic. And recent research shows about 85% of consumers expect to continue this higher level of online ordering. But with each order comes a delivery promise, and today we want to explore the risks that retailers face in keeping those promises, and we'll also look at the excuses they make for failing to keep them. How can retailers improve their chances for keeping the promises they make, even as they make more of them? Today, John Seidel of Gray Orange and Andrew Hodgson of Infosys Consulting will explore 3 common mistakes that get in the way of promise keeping and suggest actions retailers should take to avoid them. They'll also cover the value of proactively moving to a smarter approach to end-to-end fulfillment. But before we jump in, I want to briefly introduce John, Andy, and their respective organizations. So first, Gray Orange. We modernize order fulfillment through Gray Matter, which is an AI-driven fulfillment platform, a series of Ranger smart mobile robots, and a unique multi-agent orchestration technology that enables companies to improve fulfillment using whatever robots or other assistive agents they prefer. John Seidel is a partner with the Gray Orange Go5 strategy group. He's a recognized authority in warehouse technology, operations, and material handling automation. And before joining Gray Orange, John advised hundreds of companies for more than 30 years in leadership roles with Kurt Salmon, Accenture, and Deloitte. Infosys Consulting is a global management and IT consulting practice within the larger Infosys organization. Its focus is on strategy, IT transformation, change management, and business analytics. Andrew is a partner and global head of consumer goods, retail, and logistics. He too has 30 plus years of experience driving transformational change through high-value consulting work in the retail, consumer goods, and logistics verticals, and in the high-tech industry. His background also includes executive positions with Accenture and EY, as well as Manugistics, which is now part of Blue Yonder. So let's get started with this foundational question, Andy and John. Who owns delivering on order promises? And Andy, why don't you start us off? I know you have opinions on this.
Oh, I've just got a few. Thanks, Terry. So yeah, and I think it's a very timely subject when we talk about promises and the importance of keeping those promises with the holiday season. But it's, it is a tough question, right? Because clearly, if as a consumer I place an order with a retailer, my belief is that the retailer owns that promise. The reality is there's no way the retailer by themselves keeps that promise, right? Because they're dependent upon upstream consumer goods manufacturers, They're dependent on a variety of logistics partners, et cetera, to help them deliver that. So realistically, I would say from a consumer's lens, right, that retailer is the linchpin. They're my ambassador to keeping that promise. However, I think the combination of the logistics providers, the consumer goods manufacturers and retailers ultimately have to take responsibility because each of them owns a piece of that. And if I do think about it from a consumer goods manufacturer, right, at the end of the day, it's their brand that's also associated with that promise. So they have a vested stake in making sure that's kept.
Yeah, that's a good point. John, do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I think just, it's interesting, right? This promise or service level agreement almost that you're making with your end customers has really become the benchmark of success. And the control of it, achieving that success is really fragmented, both inside the retailer, but then really across the fulfillment network of third-party suppliers, transportation agents, et cetera, that are all involved in this process. So it's a relatively easy promise to understand, but certainly very difficult to perform on.
Yeah, I agree. And we're going to unpack some of the reasons why that is and difficulties that get in the way. But I did want to just touch on this bit of encouraging, I think, news from Kelsey Marion, who's the retail analyst at Gartner. She noted that Gartner's retail clients all report having made more progress, this is crazy, with their technology, process, and customer experience initiatives in the last 18 to 22 months than they've been able to make over the past decade. However, when it comes to fulfillment practices and to making and keeping customer promises through those practices, there's still quite a bit of distance to cover. But the fact that they're making progress across other dimensions does bode well for the ability to really take everything up a notch from the learnings over the past 18 to 24 months. So in the spirit of Gartner's slide here, you didn't come this far to only come this far. Let's get into the heart of the matter with the first mistake that can kill customer loyalty and even your business. And Andy, why don't you weigh in first on mistake number one, which is failing to understand the promise in total and who owns keeping it and how to coordinate among multiple owners to get to the right outcome for your customer.
No, it sounds good. So there's an interesting piece right behind that, right, which we should always think about, which is retail and consumer goods companies have gone a long ways to setting the expectation behind that promise, right? So it's one thing if I said, 10 years ago and I wanted product from a retailer, my expectation was, okay, I'm going to get in my car, drive to a store and go purchase that inventory. And hopefully it's in stock. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. Maybe I have to drive a long distance to find it, et cetera, right? So there was a set of expectations. But to your point about all the investments that have been made in personalization, in getting product to consumers, setting expectations, we've really now created our own world of promise where we say, we promise you we'll get you what you want, when you want it, where you want it. Whether that's shipped to your home, whether that's pick it up in a locker, whether it's order online, pick up in store. And oh, by the way, we've told you we can get it to you same day or next day. So I want to kind of set that as a backdrop, right? This wasn't some, world that was just created by consumers on their own whim, right? This was a world we've created, and now we've got to deliver on that promise. So really where we start falling down right away is, do we have the information that we need to be able to make promises appropriately in the first place? Do we know the inventory we have? Do we know where that inventory is? Are we making accurate projections of the logistic capability to get that product to someone? In other words, do we have realistic lead times? So when you think about making the promise, there's a lot of information that goes into being able to make that promise initially. So I'd say step number one is that retailers and consumer goods companies need to do a better job of making sure they've got accurate inventory information. Not just that I've got the inventory, but where I've got it, right? Especially if I'm talking about same day, next day, I need to know that inventory is in proximity to the consumer. Secondly, we talk about the time to move those goods. And that really means that I know throughout my entire logistics network that I've got the labor in place to handle the product, whether it's the pick, pack, ship labor, that I've got the carrier capacity to move that product. If that's last mile delivery capability, do I have, the mechanisms in place via the parcel carriers, et cetera, to get that? So having that information at my fingertips such that when I make that promise, I'm making it based on good information. To me, that's step number one, right? And that's where if retailers aren't doing a good job of having that, then they're making the wrong promise to start with.
Yeah, I agree. John, I know you've had a lot to say, and you've published in the past how retailers are really paying attention to the wrong KPIs and measuring the wrong things. And that's a little bit of what Andy was just touching on there about making the wrong promise to begin with, or, not really holding yourself to the right standard. Do you want to touch a little bit on that?
Sure. Well, and I think Andy kind of hit on it, right? The initial metric or point really of customer frustration was placing an order for something and then not receiving it because the inventory simply wasn't available. So the order management system that a lot of retailers have been investing in over the course of the last decade or so has gone a long ways towards solving that problem and having an accurate representation of what inventory is actually available to sell. So now the promise that is being broken and leading to that frustration is related to fulfillment rather than order capture. So the problem has kind of moved downstream, at least somewhat. And it's that ability to leverage inventory that's positioned close to that consumer and then actually execute the fulfillment exercise so that they receive the product when they expected to receive it in the condition and timing that they anticipated, and to Andy's point, at the destination that they anticipated, regardless of where that might be. So the flexibility to better leverage inventory coupled with that ability to manage that promise related to fulfillment is where the focus seems to be today.
Okay, good. And Andy, when we were talking in preparation for presenting this material today, you had mentioned that there's a tendency to keep the focus within the four walls of the DC and try to account for potential failure points and get ahead of them, but that not too many retailers are looking at that full end-to-end potential failure point and creating strategies to deal with them. I was wondering if you would share a little bit about that, because it leads into our next issue.
No, absolutely. So, I think back to the original point, right? When we said about who owns the promise, and I said, really, while the retailer may own it, at the end of the day, everybody in that network owns it, right? Consumer goods manufacturers, logistics providers, et cetera. So when we talk about focus and how do we execute better to keep that promise, well, really, today, so many companies focus only within their four walls, right? So if I'm a retailer, I'm looking at it and saying, am I staffing my DCs? Am I going to pick and pack and have that box ready to go? But the box sitting on the shipper's dock doesn't get it to the consumer, right? First of all, you got to make sure you got the right inventory coming in that's there even to pick. So how am I communicating and working with my consumer goods manufacturers, collaborating, doing collaborative planning with them to make sure the right inventories are planned for and that they come in? Secondly, how am I communicating with the outbound logistics provider to say the boxes are going to be ready at such and such time, and I need to make sure you've got trailers dropped? So it's those connect points between the consumer goods manufacturer who's making product and getting it to the retailers. It's the logistics providers that are figuring out where I have to have containers positioned, where do I have to have my drivers, my power equipment, et cetera. It's all of those pieces happening in coordination that ultimately keeps the promise. And the fact that today so much what's going on is still focused on my four walls, so the retailer focusing on the DC and what's happening inside there, the logistics carriers focusing on where they're positioning equipment, drivers, and the consumer goods manufacturers focusing on their raw materials, their in progress manufacturing, et cetera, but not really working collaboratively to look at that end to end, that's really where we've got to get to. So getting beyond that and thinking not just of people making those connections, because a lot of what happens today is you rely on a person to make those linkages between what's going on in the DC and the carrier. So it's a person getting on the phone or emailing and saying, you know, hey, FedEx, I need you to drop 2 trailers at my distribution center today at such and such time and plan to pick them up at this other time, right? It's a person communicating that versus actual systems that are doing the planning, that know more detail about when things are already connecting and providing a higher quality of sharing of information across that chain. That's really where we have to get to, is breaking down those barriers and not relying on people to become that, you know, glue using phone calls and emails between the different junctures of keeping the promise.
So, Andy, that's a great segue into mistake number 2, which is failing to use collaborative technology and planning and processes to communicate well with the other players that help you make and keep promises. And to your point, not just relying on the people, but using the advanced technology that's real time with algorithms and automatic data transfers and interpretations in order to make everything connect in the most seamless real-time way possible. And John, there's so much out there right now that's enabling retailers to take advantage of these capabilities. Why don't you give us some of your thoughts on the opportunities that are there for better connections?
Sure. So, Terry, there's a couple of things going on here, right? One is improved interoperability between the carriers and the fulfillment centers and other nodes that are being used to provide inventory to that fulfillment process. So there's better visibility, better real-time communications. The notion of batch, transactional data moving back and forth has pretty much gone away. And it's much more about real-time communications and visibility, not only to the transactional data itself, but available capacity and capabilities within the networks in order to affect inventory movements and deliveries, et cetera. So there is more connectivity between the links in that supply chain. But then there are other things going on to allow this to happen at scale, right? In order to kind of come back to your original comment at the beginning of the webinar about the migration to e-com from traditional brick and mortar retail, and how is that impacting all of this, right? So the capacity required in the network to execute e-commerce has gone up dramatically. So even processes or technologies that may have been collaborating previously are now under strain due to increased volume. So there are lots of investments being made by retailers and by service providers in the supply chain space to better facilitate increased volumes here. And we've seen some of the choke points in the supply chain, of course, in the media of today, but there's more and more being done to create that shared visibility to the network and then execution and improved performance within that network, true across the nodes in the supply chain and true inside the four walls of the fulfillment point, whether that's a warehouse or a store where the inventory is being leveraged to satisfy e-commerce demand.
That's great. And I'm wondering, Andy, if you could talk specifically, since I know you do quite a bit of this in your practice, could you talk to retailers having better, tighter, more seamless and real-time relationships with parcel carrier partners?
Absolutely. So, again, I want to tie us back to the fact that we did this to ourselves, right? Because we set this expectation all of a sudden that you can order stuff online, I'll have it to you same day, next day, 2 day. But by setting that expectation, right, what we've done is taken a lot of the fat or fluff out of the supply chain, a lot of our contingency, so to speak. So whereas before, when I was just shipping stuff to the stores, it's like, hey, if it's in the store, it's in the store. If it's not, it's not. I didn't tell you it would be there. Or if I set an expectation of you ordered, I can get it to you in 10 days, great. I've got lots of room for a little bit of error here and there. But now that we've tightened that all up, right, it requires a much higher level of precision in terms of our operations. And so one great example of that is that connection between, on the outbound side, between the distribution center retailer and the last mile delivery capability. So if you think about that again, on the parcel carrier, the last mile, the person actually doing that delivery, they've got to plan their drivers, they got to plan their routes, they got to plan their equipment. What equipment do I have where? When's it getting loaded? When am I picking it up? What's the route I'm dropping off on? So they've got a whole system that's sitting there calculating that out, planning out their placement of all of that, right? The empty containers, the power units, the drivers. At the same time, you've got the distribution center and the retailer saying, okay, here's all these orders flowing in to my distribution center that I've got to pick and pack and get ready to go to the consumer's home. Or conversely, at the same time, maybe I'm doing it in the same distribution center where I'm also replenishing product to stores. So they also are planning out exactly how I'm doing this, you know, where I'm allocating the inventory, how am I using my labor, do I have adequate labor, et cetera. But where those break down is where they don't connect. Because we've got to operate on such a precise level of accuracy, because we've said we're going to get it to you in a day or two, and we don't have that room to have a trailer sitting out there for 3 days while it gets loaded, we now have to have a degree of precision around when that package is ready to be loaded onto the truck or the carrier's equipment, when that driver shows up to grab that and then drive it, you know, on their route and drop the packages off. And so to get there, what we need to do is not have this, you know, human interaction like, oh, could you drop 2 trailers? But rather, we need a system like gray matter, right? Gray matter that knows the Cuban weight of all the items that have got to get delivered. Gray matter that has a much more precise view of when will that box be ready, labeled, ready to be loaded into a UPS, a FedEx, et cetera, or the container sitting out in my yard. That precision of gray matter, knowing exactly how much Cuban weight we have and when it's going to be ready, combining that into the parcel carrier network so that they know exactly how many empty containers I need to drop at a retailer's DC, when I need to drop them, when they will be ready to pick up, so I can make sure that my driver's not sitting idle waiting for the container to be finished loading, et cetera. Getting that degree of precision, connecting the best of the parcel carriers' optimization and their systems with a gray matter that's optimizing what's going on in the four walls of the DC and having them communicate takes a lot of the mistakes out of that promise, right? Out of breaking that promise. It really creates an environment where I'm knowing exactly how many packages and when they're ready. The parcel carrier knows exactly what equipment's needed, when it's going to be needed, and when the driver can pick it up. That's where we get ourselves to a point of being able to deliver a much higher level of precision and keep the promise.
That makes a lot of sense. And John, it seems like that's something that could happen now, as opposed to building additional infrastructure or finding additional capacity in drivers or equipment. So I was wondering if maybe you would take a second to say, what's involved in making that kind of connection happen?
Well, it's interesting, right? We've come from a world where when the consumer was frustrated, we had a list of excuses that we went to, right? The retailer blamed the transportation or parcel carrier. The carrier, when blamed the retailer for not shipping it on time, to really starting to embrace collaboration that's being enabled by the technology. So to Andy's point, the shared view of what inventory and shipments are going to be available to be moved when, and being able to collaborate on the effective use of the assets in the fulfillment network is so important in terms of bringing this forward. And then on top of that, providing real-time visibility to that end consumer so that they can see where their order is, right? Not only that they've placed it and when it's expected to be on their doorstep, but actually see that order moving through the pipeline and understand where it is, when it's been handed off to the carrier, where the carrier is from a tracking perspective in terms of that delivery. So it's a lot about visibility and true technologically enabled collaboration between the participants in the supply chain.
Yeah,
well,
I
just
think
to add one more thought too, right? I mean, we're talking a lot right now about the execution side of this, but remember, we made a promise at the front end, and we also talked about important to make sure we're making that promise on the basis of right information. So I think the collaboration that we're talking about now doesn't just happen at the execution end, but rather happens at the front end as well, which means that that degree of information sharing, that degree of system interconnectedness on the front end and making sure that when we set an expectation with the consumer, we're setting it based off of a shared understanding between logistics provider, retailer, et cetera. That's an important aspect of this as well, right? Because today, many of those promises are made based off heuristics or hypotheticals, right? Like, we know how long it typically takes to deliver this. We on average have this kind of capacity available. That's so really, as we're talking about this, I think it's important to call out that the degree of connection that we're talking about between shipper and carrier at a systems level happens not just on the execution side, but should be happening also up front on the planning side, so that when the promise is originally made, when I click place order and I'm given a date and time of delivery, that it's based off of that level of connection as well.
Yeah, I know in our planning session, John made a good observation in that if you are making me a promise for this holiday season that my goods will arrive on December 27th, and they do arrive on December 27th, I'm not necessarily happy. So it's about having that precision of inventory knowledge and not just heuristics, but actual real-time data for what you can execute on and make a promise toward that will really move forward the relationship between retailers, carriers, and the ultimate consumer. John, I don't know if you want to add anything else to that before we move on to our third and final mistake.
No, I think you've covered it, Terry. I mean, it's about meeting evolving consumer expectations, and oh, by the way, they're going to continue to evolve, right? I mean, it's not long before we're going to have an informed consumer that understands that the retailer is leveraging inventory across their network, and that they maybe should have choices about when they want to get it and what they should pay for freight or transportation charges, and have choices that they make at that point of order. And thus, to Andy's point, you have to have true precision in terms of your visibility to where your inventory resides relative to that consumer and what it's going to take to fulfill that promise.
Okay, excellent. So let's switch gears a little bit. We've talked a lot about all the possibilities that there are for advancing through technology and process improvement, better connections, better automated communications, moving forward our ability to make and keep promises. But some of the people that we've been talking to externally have said their feeling is, even though we're equipped so much more elegantly to be able to share all this information, people, maybe some retailers, are failing to acknowledge that consumers are fatigued by COVID as an excuse for delaying promises and breaking promises. And maybe we can touch on that just a bit to say, you know, it's a no excuses culture now. And it's a real opportunity to be to take advantage of a proving ground time that will separate true leaders from those that are just not willing to step up and improve their operations. So I don't know if Andy, maybe I'll toss that to you and see if you have a good leadership message for people.
You know, Terry, that's a great point. When we talk about the consumer fatigue with COVID being the excuse, right? First of all, the very first thing I would say is a lot of the conversations we're having with our clients is, while COVID has been a predominant factor in the disruptions that are ongoing, it's not the only factor, right? There are a number of other things, weather-related, geopolitical. You know, look at the ship blocking the Suez Canal, right? Those have nothing to do with COVID, but they've similarly impacted everything from raw material availability of packaging materials, as well as the ability to get containers across the ocean. So I think retailers and consumer goods companies all need to realize that COVID's not this one-time thing and I can blame everything on it. It's going to go away at some point and everything will return back to normal. I think what they have to take ownership of and acknowledge is that this degree of disruption probably has always been there to a certain extent. Yes, COVID become much larger, but that really the tolerance level based on the new consumer expectation and the tightness of our supply chains, the tolerance level's gone down substantially. So it's time to not give excuses, but rather shift your focus to, okay, what are the near-term things, intermediate-term things, and long-term things I need to be doing to solve this? So, you referenced the analyst point of view earlier that there's been a lot done, and that's true, absolutely, right? Are there things that are being done to set up micro-fulfillment centers, get inventory positioned closer to the consumer? Yes. Are there things that companies are doing around various delivery mechanisms using kiosk, locker, pickup in store mechanisms? Absolutely. Are there other things they need to be doing to address this? Absolutely, right? We talked about one being the connections beyond your four walls. Longer term, obviously, there are bigger asset investments that need to be made to support the volume of business. I think John mentioned earlier the scale of this. Right. So when we see that this is continuously going to be growing on a go-forward basis, there needs to be more investment in sortation centers. There needs to be more investment in home delivery networks and drivers. There needs to be more investment in automation in the DCs to handle the volume of each picks and small boxes that we're packing. So retailers, consumer goods companies really need to look at this and stop saying, okay, I can keep giving excuses, but rather really focus on, am I making the right investments near term, midterm, long term? Because this isn't changing. We're not suddenly going to shift the consumer expectation back to, okay, you can wait a week or 10 days, or, oh, we're not going to ship stuff to your house anymore. And secondly, those disruptions are going to keep happening. So it's time to stop thinking about the excuses, but rather think about, what are those investments? How do I take advantage of the technology that's available today? How do I open up my discussion beyond my four walls to my partners in this and really solve this on a long-term sustainable basis?
Yeah, that makes sense. And John, do you want to weigh in there too? We all are sharing our opinions about this crazy environment that we're operating within.
Sure. I mean, I think the reality is that the gap between Walmart and Amazon and everyone else has actually gotten larger, because I don't really see those excuses coming from the Walmarts and Amazons of the world, at least in North America, and I'm sure it's different by geography globally, but the reality is they're doing a pretty good job of keeping the promise, even in the world of a pandemic, because they have the supply chain infrastructure already in place. They've made the investment not only in the network broadly, but even in the world of fulfillment. By deploying advanced automation and robotics into their fulfillment nodes, they're able to service these orders at volume, at scale, and keep up with the growth of e-com demand, even in the world of COVID-19. So I think the winners are actually winning by more in today's world because of those investments. And other people are going to need to figure out how to address the same problems, how to keep those promises to their consumers, and how to make more aggressive promises to their consumers, unless they want to fall further behind.
Yeah, that I think we've shared lots of great information, and I'm wondering if we can go ahead and sum things up. And we do have a retailer must-do slide, and it's got a number of ideas on it. And I'm wondering, Andy, if you and John can tag team covering the information that's here and just discuss, what can people do now and today to take advantage of this, leadership opportunity to, as John just said, separate from the rest of the crowd that's making excuses, and instead hold on to your customers by making more promises and keeping the promises that you make.
So Terry, I'll go first and talk about the four walls, number one, and we'll let Andy, who's the true expert in the world of transportation and carrier management, handle the second one. But, the work that we're doing at Gray Orange, of course, is all about advanced automation and bringing the right technology to bear, whether it's in the store, the back room of the store, the micro-fulfillment center, the distribution center, or even a centralized warehouse, in order to optimize the ability to fulfill those orders. And the only way you can do that is with modern technology. It's not a batch or wave-based world anymore. Everything is real time. Everything needs to be flowing continuously. That whole notion of waiving your work and stuff is just really outdated in this day and age. The automation should be driving what is the next best task to execute based on a broader view of fulfillment, not only inside that particular node, but coordinated with the carriers, coordinated with the consumer's expectations, and being able to adapt and adjust those priorities in real time. And you just can't do that in the old world of some WMS that has a wave master releasing work in chunks to the floor. That's just not the way to do business today and keep up with those consumer promises that you've made. Andy?
Yeah, thanks, John. So, I mean, I think the first thing is, for the 30 plus years I've been doing this, right, companies always talk about wanting a burning platform as a basis for making investments like this, right? And so I think hopefully we've painted a fairly clear picture of the burning platform, but just to put kind of an exclamation point on that, the other thing we haven't touched on is consumers' tolerance for not keeping the promise. And I think one of the things that research has shown is that there's very low tolerance. If a retailer fails to meet the commitment that they've made to a consumer, how many times do you think that consumer goes back? So I think the sooner retailers acknowledge that I don't have 3 or 4 or 5 strikes with every consumer before they decide to go elsewhere, I got to get this right, and I got to get it right now. So let's put that as an underpinning of the burning platform for why these are must-dos. Then secondly, to John's point, right, it's the technology's out there. We're not talking about some alpha technology idea that maybe in the next 5 years it'll mature into a usable format. This is there. It really does come down to it that, if I'm talking on the carrier level now, really going in and supplementing those processes with better data, better communication. When I talk about communication, it's outside my 4 walls, it's upstream to the manufacturers, it's all the communication across logistics providers, right? When we talk about inbound logistics, it's not as simple as saying there's one partner, but rather we've got freight forwarders, we've got customs clearance, we've got inland drayage movements that are happening, we've got ocean containers, air containers. So really making sure we're managing across that whole logistics network and effectively collaborating in a multimodal fashion. That's number one. Number two, we are starting to see the emergence of more of, I'll call it a platform or marketplace environment where one provider or a couple of providers are getting together and figuring out how do we become the single throat to choke, and how do we take that burden off of the retailer and give them one point of contact for that entire network. So that's a second thing that we are starting to see emerge. And I think retailers going in and finding those and taking advantage of those is a key part of this as well. And then third is really making that connection between what's going on inside the 4 walls of the DC, what's going on inside the manufacturing plants and the CPG companies, and bridging that effectively by connecting the systems, connecting the data. That's an investment that has to be made today. The technology is there to do it. The platforms are there to do it. And again, as I mentioned, the burning platform's there because consumer tolerance for not meeting the expectation or not meeting your promise is extremely low.
Well, maybe that gets to both of you making a comment on the last bullet there, which is build bridges instead of pointing fingers. The consumer doesn't care if your point of view is the carrier was at fault or if the retailer was at fault. They expect there to be a partnership in servicing their desires in the way they want to be serviced. So John, maybe you can comment on some ways that the folks who are attending today can work with Infosys and work with Gray Orange to build those bridges.
So, I think, and this is actually super important because this isn't just about technology or even just about process redesign. There's a big change management exercise that's taking place to adjust the expectations of all of the participants in the order capture, order management, order fulfillment process. And working with a firm like Infosys, where they can help you think through not only your supply chain strategy in terms of where you want to position your inventory and what is your channel flow strategy for that inventory based on how it's going to be consumed, but that they can really help you change the way you think about success in terms of the customer experience, in terms of how you're going to measure your own success, what's the underlying technology you need, what is the strategy that you need to put in place to keep those customer promises? So, I wish it was as easy as everybody just buying robots from Gray Orange, but the reality is this really is a supply chain transformation that needs to occur. And that's a journey. And if you're not well down that path already, it's a journey that you need to embark on already.
Yeah, so I think pragmatically, the first thing I would say, and I do say this to a lot of my clients, is when you're thinking about investing in a technology, warehouse automation is a great example, right? If I'm going to go in and engage with Gray Orange on automating what's going on inside the four walls of my DC, my first point to many of my clients is don't do it by yourself. Bring in your carrier partner as a part of the design process, right? So when you're sitting down having design thinking workshops around what are the capabilities I'm building in this new system or this new capability? How will it operate? What data will it get? Don't do that in a vacuum, right? If you expect on the back end of this to be able to execute in collaboration with those partners, then you certainly should be bringing them in upfront to the design thinking of the capability itself. So I'm constantly talking to my clients about if you're designing a new supply chain, bring in your manufacturers, bring in your logistics partners, bring in your retail partners if you're a CPG company. Bring in their thinking because they're going to bring a point of view of what might help them execute better on their end on your behalf. So starting up front in the process of actually designing these capabilities and implementing these capabilities, starting by bringing them in as partners then, only ensures a much higher probability of success that they'll collaborate with you and you'll be able to collaborate with them when you're actually using that technology or using that new solution on the execution end.
Makes all the sense in the world. We do, I think, have time. We have a couple of questions, and I think we have enough time to take them. One is this type of collaborative communication and integration between retailer, DCs, and parcel carriers and manufacturers makes a lot of sense. Why hasn't it already happened? What's getting in the way? Andy?
I just think I think it's a legacy mentality of, maybe there's a little bit of sense of confidentiality of my information, my data, how I operate, what my cost structures are. There's again, for as long as I've been doing this, there's tends to be kind of this legacy mindset of if I'm going to implement a new technology, I'm going to do it myself, right? And maybe I'll bring in a consulting partner or a software partner or a Gray Orange, but I'm going to do it. This idea of opening up the four walls to let other external companies come in and help me think about how I design and implement something just isn't a natural part of our DNA. Now that's changing, right? But I think that's a big part of the reason why this hasn't happened historically. I think also we're all just kind of scrambling to barely keep our heads above water on meeting that promise. And so taking the time to step back for a second and say, how do I do something longer term, more sustainable than meeting it, is somewhere we're just getting to now. So I think those two things, just that natural DNA of it's my company, my data, my dollars, I'm going to figure out how I spend it, to really just getting by right now on dealing with what's going on in the disruption. I think those two things, as we get past them, will really open up the doors for this more.
Yeah, I'm wondering, John, that was a great and thorough answer by Andy. Does it make sense for you to just go to the next question? Please do feel free to add something to Andy's point of view on that previous question, but we also have a question asking, what's a typical process for making this happen in my organization? Andy just talked to involving more than just your own company and getting some outside help and a collective point of view. But are there some real take these 3 steps in the next month kind of advice you could give?
So Terry, I think, that foundationally to the previous question, right? The supply chain has always been seen as a cost center. And it's how do I minimize my cost per unit shipped, and how am I going to execute fulfillment in the most cost-effective way as possible? And those were the metrics against which supply chain performance was measured. And while obviously doing it at an efficient cost is still going to always be important, really empowering the supply chain to take responsibility for customer satisfaction and customer satisfaction, right? Keeping this promise allows you to look at the bigger picture and think about things like strategically, where do I need to position my inventory in order to best make my customer happy? where do I need to effectively utilize labor, whether it's at a store level or fulfillment point? How do I partner with my carriers, et cetera? So then there's this question of where do I start, right? And I think you can partner with a firm like Infosys or even work internally to really evaluate how is your supply chain evolving? How are you differently leveraging the nodes in that network? What role is the store playing in cross-channel or omni-channel fulfillment? And then once you understand the roles of the node, then looking at your inventory and determining what inventory should flow through which nodes in that network in order to be effectively consumed is kind of the next step. And that's a perfect use of a professional services firm to come in and help. And then finally, there is the actual act of fulfillment, right? And that's when the technology and the advanced automation comes to play. And the process there is to collaborate with a firm like Gray Orange to understand how are you going to make that leap from legacy automation of conveyors and sorters and things into the world of robotics and advanced automation, and what is the right type of automation that's going to be appropriate. And it can range from a picker assist cobot solution all the way up to a fully automated solution, or, in the middle in our world of around goods to person and mobile sortation. So there are a lot of options out there that are appropriate based on different use cases, different value propositions, et cetera. So, how do I, after I've lived through peak, what do I need to do leveraging the lessons that I've learned around the customer experience, and how am I going to make it different in time for peak next year?
That's perfect. And maybe touch a little bit on the models that kind of de-risk just getting started, to your point, not having to boil the ocean, but maybe test and learn along these new dimensions for fulfillment.
Thanks, Terry. Yeah, so how do you get into this, right? Where do you get started once you've completed the assessment and you understand that there might be an opportunity for you to better leverage automation or even a collaborative work environment with your third-party service providers? And you're not going to do everything all at once, right? That doesn't make any sense, regardless of which aspect of this you're talking about. In our world of Gray Orange, typically our customers are starting out with a single facility within their network where we're introducing robotic automation and our Gray Matter software to better orchestrate fulfillment from that node in the network. We do that for a couple of reasons. One is to validate the integration of the new technology with the legacy technology or host applications and kind of all of the IT considerations around interoperability of the new robotic technology with whatever legacy systems are still in place. And then secondarily, I think it's to build confidence within the organization from a process redesign and a business continuity standpoint, so that even though, to Andy's earlier point, we all know the technology is work and it's proven at scale in production environments around the world, it's still a big change for the retailer that's adopting it for the first time, and the ability to create that level of comfort and confidence in an advanced automation solution is super important. So typically a pilot site, whether that's a micro fulfillment center, a store back room, or a distribution center, based on the use case where the greatest value is going to come from, where you're going to get the best pilot of the technology, that's where you start. But then you need to be prepared to move to scale quickly, because to my earlier point, you're already behind the people that are using this at scale in the global market. And if you spend another year or two just validating something that's already proven in the market, that gap is only going to increase.
All very good points. Andy, any last comments before we invite people to just take the conversation directly to the two of you with the contact information that is displayed here? You want to close us out?
I think this has been a great conversation. I think we've really laid out the issue, right? We've talked about the promise. I think we've elaborated on the fact that it's not any one particular party's responsibility nor ability to keep that. So I think to that last question, the sooner a company acknowledges that I can't solve this alone, right? I need partners. Now those partners can be technology and solution partners like Gray Orange. They can be integration partners like Infosys. But most importantly, I think you've got to acknowledge those are partners, shippers, carriers, manufacturers. Bring them together. The sooner people acknowledge that, much like it's not the responsibility of one party to keep the problem or to keep the promise. It's also not their ability to solve it in isolation. So step one to me is acknowledge that, identify some strategic partners that you want to go solve this with, some of your best manufacturers, your best retailer if you're a manufacturer, and your strategic partners in the carrier side. Bring them together, solve it together.
I love that. Bring it together, solve it together needs to be on everybody's closing slide. So I think I will, with that and this contact information that we're sharing, I think I'll turn it back over to Laura Beth for any final logistics.
Excellent. Well, great presentation from you all, and thank you for joining today's webinar. And a big thanks to our speakers for such an informative presentation and absolutely timely presentation. As a reminder, you'll be emailed a link that gives you on-demand access to today's presentation so you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues. Have a great day, everyone.